Stop acting like a coward, Debbie. We're already 6 hours behind. Trent Malloy said it at 5:42 a.m., loud enough to cut through the diesel hum, the gull noise, and the slow metal clank of rigging chain being dragged across wet concrete. The fog on Pier 14 sat low and thick, the kind of advection fog that rolled in off cold water and turned floodlights into pale white coins with no edges. Men and machines were reduced to silhouettes inside it. Even the harbor cranes across the channel had vanished. Malloy stood 10 feet from Debbie Chambers and pointed at her cab as if he were pointing at a stalled truck in traffic, not a 31-ton pick under marine conditions. His hard hat was clean, his jacket dry, his boots barely marked. Hers were caked in gray slurry from yesterday's pour. By noon, 1 man would be dead, 3 would be injured, and the company would begin burning cash in 8-figure stacks. At 5:42, none of that had happened yet. For the moment, this was still a sentence, a finger, a supervisor trying to make humiliation do the work of planning. Debbie had 16 winters on marine jobs, and she moved with the practiced economy of someone who knew that hesitation and haste could look identical from a distance, but feel nothing alike in the body. She was NCCCO, certified on lattice boom crawler cranes, plus rigger and signal person qualified, and she made $124,000 a year because she could read load charts the way other people read street signs. Radius, boom angle, gross capacity, deductions for rigging weight, dynamic amplification, wind sail, swing path, tail clearance. Numbers were never abstract to her. Numbers were geometry with consequences. The crane on the pad was a 300-ton class lattice boom crawler with a 22-ton counterweight package and a house that could swing faster than most people remembered to breathe. They were set up to fly a precast caisson segment weighing 31 tons at a 96-foot working radius, out over the quay edge and toward a barge tie-in. Under normal visibility, that was a disciplined lift with no heroics. In visibility under 20 feet, with a blind rear arc and active traffic in the yard, it turned into a chain of dependencies where one missing confirmation could knock every other layer loose. Debbie stood at the bottom of the ladder with her pre-lift clipboard in one hand and radio in the other, and she watched Malloy close distance, shoulders high, jaw set in that managerial fury that, to her eye, had less to do with safety or production and more to do with being contradicted in front of a crew. "Did you hear me?" he snapped. "Or are we doing this dance again?" She kept her voice level. "I heard you. I'm not lifting until I can verify swing clearance and signal position." He gave a short laugh that carried no humor. "Verify, verify, verify. You know what I hear? Lazy. I hear someone hiding behind procedure because she doesn't want to work in weather." 2 riggers near the tag lines went still. The signalman, Luis Ortega, looked down at his gloves as though he could find a neutral place to stand inside that exchange. On marine sites, everybody understood hierarchy. Everybody also understood that once a supervisor called an operator lazy in front of the crew, the conversation was no longer technical. It was about power. And power under schedule pressure was where bad decisions got dressed up as leadership. Debbie felt the first hit of disbelief, then the hotter second pulse beneath it, the one that came when an insult crossed from rude into strategic. Coward was not just an insult. Lazy was not just an insult. They were tools intended to isolate the person saying no. She turned and looked through the fog toward where the rear swing path would travel when the house slewed left. She could see perhaps 18 feet before gray swallowed detail. The exclusion zone cones behind the crane were barely visible from where she stood, and she knew from experience that visibility always looked better from directly in front of an object than from the blind side where counterweight moved. The difference between line of sight and assumption was exactly where people got crushed, pinned, or burned. Malloy took another step toward her. I have trucks stacked, barge windows closing, and concrete cure clocks running. Do your job. I am doing my job, she said. My job is to run the lift safely or not run it. He shook his head and threw his hands once in the air, performing exasperation for the benefit of every set of eyes around them. Obsolete thinking, that's what this is. You old operators think weather is an excuse. We have radios, spotters, and a schedule. The word obsolete landed harder than coward. Coward attacked nerve. Obsolete attacked worth. Debbie had trained half the younger operators now working waterfront projects from Tacoma to Ketchikan. She had done emergency picks in sleet with frozen sheaves and load cell drift. She had sat through fatality stand-downs and watched men scrub black ribbons off hard hats because families had asked to keep things private. She knew exactly what modern operations looked like, and she knew exactly which corners were always described as temporary right before they became permanent habits. From the upper deck of the batch plant, someone killed a generator for maintenance, and the drop in background noise made the yard feel suddenly close, as if the fog had moved inward. Malloy lowered his voice, but the contempt sharpened. You want to make this about your feelings, go home. You want to keep this badge, you climb in that seat. Debbie set the clipboard on a crate and faced him square. My feelings aren't in this. Geometry is. At this radius, in this visibility, I cannot visually confirm the counterweight tail swing clearance or maintain direct signal contact for the full path. If one person drifts into the blind arc, we won't know until impact. That's not caution theater, Trent. That's basic lift control. He rolled his eyes toward the crew, inviting them into the joke. Listen to this. Geometry. We pour concrete for a living, not launch rockets. A few people gave brittle half smiles and looked away. Nobody laughed fully. Debbie noticed that, and so did he. 3 days earlier, Malloy had received an email from regional operations tying a 6-figure incentive to finishing the concrete set by Friday, and Debbie had watched him change after it. Since then, toolbox talks were shortened, inspection windows compressed, and every delay hit him like a personal challenge to his authority. He was not, in Debbie's view, a stupid man. He looked like a pressured man with a bonus ladder in front of him and a belief that pressure could substitute for control. She had seen this pattern before. First, the deadline became sacred. Then procedure became negotiable. Then anyone who named a limit became the problem. Malloy jabbed a thumb toward the crane cab. You know what I think? I think you're afraid to make decisions. I think you hide behind rules and call it professionalism. Debbie held his gaze. Rules are written in blood, and the machine does not care who signs your timesheet. That line changed the temperature. Luis looked up. One of the riggers muttered, She's right. Almost too low to hear. Malloy heard it anyway. His face tightened. This is my site, he said. I give the orders. And physics outranks both of us, Debbie said. He barked out a single laugh and leaned in. Physics? You want physics? Here it is. We lose this window, we miss tide, we pay standby on 2 crews and a tug, and I answer for it. You can't see that because you're paid to sit. Debbie felt the insult hit again, cleaner this time, because it revealed the underlying accusation. Not just cowardly, not just lazy, but overpaid dead weight. She could have answered with salary numbers and certification cards. She could have listed every emergency she had prevented that never made a report, because prevention looked like nothing happened. Instead, she answered with procedure, because procedure was the only language that still had a chance to protect the men standing around them. Then answer for a delay, she said, not for an avoidable casualty. Malloy's shoulders went rigid. Big words. You love those casualty protocol systems. We are lifting 1 piece of concrete 20 yards. 1 piece of concrete at 31 tons, she said, at 96 feet, with blind swing. He snapped back immediately. You're making it sound dramatic. No, Debbie said. I'm making it sound accurate. Fog beaded on her radio mic. Somewhere off to the east, a foghorn gave a long, low note that seemed to flatten the yard for 3 seconds. Workers on the next pad were visible only as moving reflective stripes. The running light plant near the manifold coughed once, then steadied. Debbie marked all of it without trying. Good operators collected scene data the way good medics collected vitals. Malloy gestured toward the office trailer. I can have your access pulled by breakfast. Do not test me. This was the moment insult turned into threat, and Debbie felt the crew register it as one body. She could sense the old social gravity trying to pull everyone toward compliance. Keep your head down, run the lift, deal with consequences later. She had seen that gravity before. It always felt practical in the moment. It always looked monstrous in the report. She picked up her clipboard again, not as a shield, but as a record. Her handwriting stayed neat, even when her pulse climbed. She noted time, location, lift ID, weather condition, and supervisor directive pending. The act of writing steadied her. Malloy watched and sneered. What are you doing, writing a novel? Logging a safety objection, she said. For fog? For zero visibility tail swing under load. He stepped back, spread his arms toward the crane, and spoke in a carrying voice meant for everyone on the pad. You hear this? She'd rather write than work. Nobody answered. The silence was not support. Not yet. It was the silence of workers waiting to see whether knowledge would be punished in public. Debbie clipped the pen to the board and looked up at him one more time. You can call me coward, lazy, obsolete, whatever helps you sleep. I won't pretend I can see what I cannot see. The sentence hung there, simple and hard. Malloy stared at her as if language itself had betrayed him, as if a subordinate was not supposed to speak in complete, mechanistic truths where everyone could hear. In the fog, the crane sat like a dark skeletal animal at rest. Boom, vanishing into gray, counterweight hidden behind mist. All that stored momentum waiting for a command. The yard held still around that waiting, and the insult that was supposed to force obedience instead marked the exact line where this morning began to break. Debbie moved first, because standing still in a fog bank with a loaded argument and a parked crane was how people drifted into bad choices. She stepped past Malloy without touching him, raised her radio and used the calm cadence operators used when they wanted everyone's pulse to drop half a notch. Luis, on me at the rear house. Tagline team hold position. Nobody enters tail swing. I want eyes on the anti-collision module now. Her voice carried farther than the shouting had. Work boots scraped, chains settled, and 2 riggers backed away from the painted arc marks around the crane's rear deck. Malloy said nothing for 3 seconds, which on that pad felt like a procedural victory. Then he followed, close enough that she could hear him breathing through his nose in short, irritated bursts. At 5:46 a.m., the fog had thickened enough that the boom tip had disappeared entirely, and the crane's own warning beacon glowed as a red halo with no visible fixture at its center. Debbie reached the left side catwalk and climbed to the house deck, gloved hand on damp rail, clipboard tucked under her arm. Luis came up behind her slower, scanning down and out by habit, even though the view collapsed into gray 20 feet away. On the rear corner sat the anti-collision assembly, a weatherproof box feeding 2 short-range proximity sensors aimed across the counterweight swing envelope. In clear conditions, those sensors gave the operator a secondary check that the tail had room to move. In blind conditions, secondary checks became primary survival. She tapped the module cover with her knuckle. Watch the indicator. The lamp stayed dark for a beat, flashed red twice, went black, then returned in a dull, steady glow that wavered at the edges like a failing brake light. Debbie looked at the lamp. Then she looked at Luis. Intermittent fault is still active. Luis frowned. Could be condensation. Could be, Debbie said. Could also be shorting at connector, misread distance, false clear. Intermittent means untrusted. She keyed her radio. Cab panel check coming, keep this area sterile. She crossed to the access ladder, climbed into the operator cab, and powered the diagnostic page on the LMI panel. LMI meant load moment indicator, the system that tracked boom angle, radius, and load state to prevent overload. On this machine, the anti-collision module fed a separate rear arc status line into that display. The screen blinked through startup and landed on a yellow advisory with a red subcode, RACM-31 COM drop. She pressed test. For 6 seconds the code cleared. Then it returned with an audible chirp, 1 short pulse every 2 seconds. Malloy leaned into the doorway, voice tight with forced patience. The crane starts. The crane runs. We lift. Debbie kept her eyes on the screen. The crane also warns. We listen. You're reading ghosts. She pointed to the code. No, I'm reading a communication dropout on rear anti-collision. That means the system cannot guarantee rear arc detection continuously. In fog, that is not optional. Malloy gave a dry laugh. Rear arc detection is a convenience feature. Luis spoke from below, louder than usual, as if he wanted his words on record. It's installed for a reason, Trent. Malloy shot him a look over his shoulder but didn't answer him. Debbie climbed down from the cab with a stubby screwdriver and a clean rag from her kit. She knelt at the module box, broke the seal screws, and lifted the cover. Cold water droplets clung to the inside like sweat on glass. The connector block sat in a shallow pocket of moisture, and a thin green film traced 1 pin on the lower right corner, where the plating had started to oxidize. The rubber gasket on the lid had a flattened section and a small tear near 1 screw boss, enough for fog condensation and spray to wick inside over repeated shifts. Debbie angled her headlamp and exhaled once through her teeth. There it is. Luis crouched beside her. Water in the housing? Water and corrosion at pin 9, she said. And look here. She touched the cable harness where it entered the gland. The strain relief had loosened, and the outer jacket showed chafe from vibration against the bracket edge. This jacket's been rubbing. Not through yet, but close. Below the box, the sensor bracket itself was bolted to a welded tab on the counterweight frame. Debbie ran her glove across the weld toe and felt a slight catch. She wiped the surface with the rag, then held the headlamp low. A hairline crack traced 3 centimeters along the weld edge, dark with grime, nearly invisible until the oblique light caught it. Not a catastrophic fracture, but enough to allow tiny bracket movement under vibration. Tiny movement on a proximity sensor became inaccurate distance readings. In clear weather, a cautious operator could compensate with visual checks. In zero visibility, that margin vanished. Cracked weld on the sensor mount, she said. Luis didn't try to minimize it. That wasn't on yesterday. Could have started yesterday, Debbie said. Could have grown overnight. Either way, it's active now. Malloy folded his arms. That is cosmetic. Debbie turned the lamp toward him and held it steady on the crack line. Cosmetic is paint. This is structure. He looked for half a second and then looked away, dismissing with posture what he couldn't dismiss with evidence. We are not shutting down for a scratch. It is not a scratch, Debbie said. The sensor alignment can drift. If it drifts outward, it reads, open space where there isn't any. False clear. One rigger at ground level, Aaron Pike, called up through the fog. Deb, you want photos? Yes, Debbie said. Time-stamped, close and mid-range. Include indicator lamp. Aaron lifted his phone and took 3 shots from below, while Debbie held the module open and Luis shined his own light across the connector face. The shutter clicks sounded sharp in the damp air. Malloy rubbed his jaw, eyes moving between the phone and Debbie's hands as if documentation itself were an insubordination. She reseated the connector, dried what moisture she could without pretending that wiping fixed ingress, and reassembled the cover to keep additional water out. Then she stood, braced one hand on the rail, and gave the explanation she knew the whole crew needed. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because compressed schedules encouraged magical thinking. Listen up. Intermittent fault means this. Sometimes the module talks, sometimes it goes blind. The crack means the sensor can shift. If we slew left with a load and lose rear detection for even 4 seconds, counterweight can enter occupied space with no warning. At this radius, tail speed is high enough that a step late is no step at all. Aaron asked, could spotters cover it? Not in this fog, Debbie said. Spotters are line-of-sight tools. Right now we don't have line of sight. We have silhouettes and guesses. Luis added, I can't hold hand signal continuity once that boom goes over key. I lose her at 20 feet. Malloy answered from behind them, voice rising again. Then use radio. That's what radios are for. Debbie nodded once. Radios fail too. We run redundancy. Visual plus radio plus sensor. You're asking me to run one channel and hope. You're paid to operate, he snapped. I am operating now, she said. I am diagnosing a failed safety layer. The fog carried diesel smell from the generators and a sweeter petroleum note from the temporary fuel manifold feeding heaters and light plants along the pad. Debbie followed the smell with her eyes and saw the manifold line crossing near the painted exclusion boundary behind the crane, not inside it, but closer than she liked for blind operation. The line was strapped to portable stanchions and linked with quick connect couplers, a setup intended for temporary use and gentle traffic. Counterweight contact would not need to be hard to tear a coupling. A glancing hit at swing speed could shear it, she pointed. Move that manifold 10 feet west minimum if you want this area even conditionally ready. Aaron looked over. We can drag it, but we need shut down and bleed. Do it, Debbie said. Controlled. Malloy cut in. No, leave it. We're not repiping at dawn for hypothetical problems. Debbie fixed her attention on the manifold as she spoke, because naming mechanism out loud mattered. Not hypothetical. Known swing envelope, known visibility loss, known sensor fault, known ignition sources. That's a chain, Trent. He stepped closer, boots clanging on deck plate. You always build chains, worst-case chains. That's why production hates your shifts. Louise straightened, offended on her behalf. Production likes being open tomorrow. Debbie put a hand out slightly toward Louise, a quiet signal to stay out of direct collision. Then she crouched again and used a paint marker from her vest to circle the cracked weld and write the time beside it. 5:52. She marked the module cover with the fault code and drew an arrow to the compromised gasket edge. Physical marks turned verbal disagreements into tangible conditions. She took her own photos from 3 angles, including one with Malloy in frame at the edge. Not for drama, but for context. If this went to review, context prevented later revisionism. The light plant to the east kicked to a higher idle fan noise rising. Debbie watched its exhaust shimmer in the floodlight haze and thought through ignition distances automatically. Atomized fuel did not need much. Fine droplets plus air plus a hot surface produced consequences that outran shouting. She keyed radio again. All Pier 14 crew, maintain no-go in rear swing until further notice. This is a formal hold for safety system fault and visibility deficiency. One of the younger riggers, Tane, answered with evident relief. Copy hold. Another voice, farther out in the fog, echoed. Copy. Malloy's face hardened at hearing the hold acknowledged by multiple workers. He lowered his voice to a threatening quiet. You don't issue site-wide holds. I do. Debbie replied at the same volume. Operator can refuse unsafe motion. That authority exists for exactly this moment. He stared at her, then at the red lamp now glowing steady with occasional flicker through the wet lens cover. If that light is your excuse, we can tape over it and get moving. Debbie did not blink. Tape changes nothing in the circuit. He gave a short, contemptuous chuckle. But it landed weakly because everyone on the deck had seen the water in the housing and the crack in the weld. She could feel the crew's attention leaning toward evidence despite hierarchy, and that was always the fragile pivot in industrial incidents. The minute when facts still had a path to win. She moved to the panel again and ran a second diagnostic with Louise watching over her shoulder. Code present. Signal dropout count incremented from 3 to 7 during the test cycle. She read the number aloud so no one could claim later that they had misunderstood severity. Dropouts accumulating under static condition. Under swing vibration, it will worsen. Louise repeated it for the men below. Dropouts climbing. Not stable. Debbie shut the test page, engaged the swing lock, and removed the ignition key from the crane's run panel. She held it up once, plainly visible, then put it in her breast pocket. Not theatrical, procedural. An uncommanded or coerced start could not happen while she remained custodian of the key. The yard felt quieter for a moment, though machinery still hummed, and the foghorn sounded again from open water. Malloy watched that movement with a disbelief that was turning into anger in real time. Debbie could read the next phase forming in him. the move from technical disagreement to power enforcement. She took one final step in the technical beat before that shift landed. She opened her log sheet and wrote, in block letters, rear anti-collision intermittent fault verified visual. Moisture ingress confirmed. Sensor bracket weld cracked. 0 visibility conditions present. Lift on hold. Pending repair and verification. She signed her name, printed her certification number beneath it, and handed the board to Luis long enough for him to initial as witness. Then she took it back and faced the fog-hidden yard, where 31 tons of concrete waited in silence for a command that physics had not yet approved. Malloy did not wait for the ink to dry. "Give me the key," he said, holding out his hand like she was a child caught with contraband. Debbie kept the clipboard against her chest and left her other hand in her vest pocket over the metal key, feeling its ridges through the fabric. She answered in the same even tone she had used all morning, because volume had never lifted a load and never stopped one from killing someone. "No. Not until the fault is repaired, the bracket is evaluated, and we run a verified dry swing with full visibility." Malloy's expression hardened into theatrical disbelief. "You think you run this yard?" She shook her head once. "I run that crane, and that crane doesn't move blind with a known rear arc fault. We have 0 visual continuity past 20 feet, intermittent comms on RACM, a cracked sensor mount, and a live fuel manifold near tail swing. That is the mechanism, not an opinion." He glanced at the crew to see who was watching. Everybody was watching. Luis stood near the catwalk rail, jaw tight, radio at his chin. Aaron and Tane had stopped pretending to adjust taglines. Even workers from the adjacent pad had shifted closer to the fog edge where they could hear. On industrial sites, people learned to hear the difference between argument and pre-incident language. This had crossed that line 10 minutes ago. At 5:54 a.m., the fog had turned the yard lights into floating halos and flattened distance until 10 feet looked like 30 and 30 looked like blank space. Debbie angled the clipboard so Malloy could read the line she had written. "Formal hold. You want it lifted? You own the override in writing." He barked a laugh. "You want paperwork now? We're pouring concrete, not filing taxes." Debbie did not move. "Then make a field risk acceptance and sign it." Malloy stepped in so close she could smell mint from his gum over the diesel and salt air. "You're done hiding behind forms?" She turned her head just enough so her voice projected to the deck below. "Everyone listen. This is the technical basis for refusal. Tail swing radius at current setup extends into the rear hazard zone. Rear anti-collision module is dropping signal under static test. Moisture ingress and corrosion are present at connector pin 9. Sensor bracket weld is cracked, which can shift alignment. In this fog, I cannot maintain visual confirmation of personnel, obstacles, or manifold clearance through the full slew path. If we move load now, we are operating on assumption. Assumption is how people die on cranes." She felt the words land in the silence. Malloy tried to cut across her. "Stop with the drama." She kept speaking, louder by 1 degree, nothing more. "A 31-ton caisson at 96 feet creates rotational momentum that does not care about rank. If the rear arc goes blind for 4 seconds at swing speed, counterweight can strike fixed or temporary assets before any spotter can call it. If that asset is fuel piping, atomized diesel drifts and finds ignition. This is basic cause and effect." Luis added from below. That's exactly what she said earlier. Nothing changed except the fog got thicker. Malloy snapped. Nobody asked you. Debbie looked at the cracked weld, ringed in paint, then back to Malloy. I am refusing the lift. That refusal is final under operator authority. He pointed at her chest. I gave a direct order. And I gave a direct safety refusal, she said. Company Manual Section 12.4 says, operator may halt any lift for unresolved hazard. Federal standard says no operation where hazards can't be controlled. You can quote schedule all day. Physics still writes the report. Malloy's lips compressed. He shifted tactics to ridicule, the old move when technical ground disappears. 16 winners and this is what it buys us? A lecture and a parked machine. Debbie felt the jab, then set it down. 16 winters is why this machine is still parked. The foghorn on the channel sounded again, long and low, vibrating through steel decking. Somewhere behind the batching plant, a forklift reverse alarm chirped, then cut out. Debbie watched the red advisory lamp on the module flicker twice and return to steady. She pointed to it. There, dropout event. You saw it. Malloy didn't even look this time. That light is moisture noise. Moisture noise on a safety circuit is still a failed safety circuit. You are not an engineer. I don't need to be. I need to follow the limitations chart and functional status. The machine is telling us no. Malloy's face flushed under the hard hat strap. He grabbed the catwalk rail and leaned forward. One pick. We move this one piece, then you can write poems about procedures. Debbie answered without delay. No blind lift with unresolved rear detection and compromised visibility, not one pick, not 1 inch. For 3 seconds, no one spoke. Water dripped from boom cords into shallow puddles below, rhythmic and faint. Diesel engines idled at different frequencies across the yard, a rough metallic chorus under the fog. She could feel every eye on the key in her pocket. She knew exactly what came next, because this pattern had repeated in other yards, other supervisors, other years. Technical refusal, then humiliation, then threat. He gave her the threat. Hand me that key or hand me your badge. She held his gaze and took a breath deep enough to slow her pulse. You can remove me from the site. You cannot force my hands on those controls under these conditions. He jabbed a finger toward the ground. I can do more than remove you. I can terminate your assignment before breakfast. Then do it on record, she said. State that you terminated a certified operator for refusing a blind lift with documented safety faults. Malloy looked past her and shouted, Jace, get up here. Foreman Jace Weller appeared through the fog from the trailer side, phone already in hand, face tight in that careful blank way foremen used when they knew they might be deposed later. He stopped 2 steps short of the ladder and didn't climb. Yeah. Malloy pointed at Debbie. Witness this. I am issuing a direct order to proceed with lift 17. Operator is refusing. Debbie corrected him immediately. Witness this too. Operator refusal cites specific active hazards and failed redundancy. Jace glanced between them, thumb hovering over his phone screen. I'm recording audio, he said quietly. Malloy spun on him. Put that away. Jace did not. Policy says I can document a contested safety stop. That mattered. Debbie felt it. Documentation turned fog into dates, names, and statements that could survive memory games. Malloy pressed his palms against his hips and exhaled through his nose. Fine. Record this. Debbie Chambers is relieved of crane duty, effective now for insubordination and failure to execute assigned lift. The words hit like a steel door. No one moved. Debbie kept her voice precise. Noted. Time 5:58. Relieved after formal safety refusal. She unclipped her badge from her jacket, held it up where Jace's phone could see, and set it on the clipboard. Her fingers were steady. That steadiness cost effort, but she gave none of it away. Malloy extended his hand again. Key. I will transfer custody to Foreman with hazard note, she said. Not to you directly while override is disputed. He laughed once, sharp and humorless. You don't set transfer terms after being fired. Custody chain protects everyone, she said, including you. He took a half step as if to grab her pocket. Luis moved between them without touching either one. Back up, Trent. The deck went still. Malloy stared at Luis, then at the men below, who had all stopped working to watch. He chose optics over escalation and dropped his hand. Fine. Foreman takes it. Debbie pulled the key from her pocket and placed it in Jace's open palm. Then she spoke for the recording, each phrase distinct. Crane ignition key transferred at 5:59 to Foreman Jace Weller under protest. Lift remains on safety hold from operator due to unresolved RACM communication dropouts, moisture ingress, corroded connector pin, cracked sensor bracket weld, zero visibility rear swing, and fuel manifold proximity within potential strike path. Recommendation: stand down, isolate manifold, repair module, inspect weld, verify sensor alignment, conduct dry swing in clear conditions. Jace closed his fingers around the key and nodded once. Received. Malloy pointed at Debbie's badge on the clipboard. Take your things and go to the trailer. You're off this pad. She stepped down from the house deck to the concrete, boots splashing in a shallow film of water and slurry. She did not leave. She moved to the edge of the exclusion line and stayed where she could still see enough of the crane base to witness what happened next. Malloy saw her and shouted, I said trailer, she answered. I am clear of operations and waiting for transport. I am also a witness. He turned away from her and keyed his own radio. Need an operator on Pier 14 now. Send Evan. Through static, dispatch answered. Evan Rudd en route from South Yard, 2 minutes. Debbie knew Evan. 26, recently signed off for independent picks. Good hands, not enough scars yet. He followed procedure when given time. Under pressure, he tried to please whoever held his schedule. That combination had broken many people. She keyed her radio on a separate channel and reached him before he arrived. Evan, it's Debbie. Critical hazard advisory before you touch that cab. Rear anti-collision is intermittent with active dropouts. Sensor mount has a crack. Visibility is near zero at rear arc. Fuel manifold sits close to swing envelope. Do not move load until corrected. Static hissed for a beat. Then Evan's voice came, cautious. Copy, I heard you. Malloy's radio cracked almost immediately. Same channel, louder. Ignore side chatter. Report direct to me. Debbie kept her radio down after that. She had delivered the warning in plain language. He had acknowledged it. That record existed now, whether Malloy liked it or not. Evan arrived out of the fog in a high-vis jacket, still clean at the cuffs, hard hat lamp on, lunchbox in one hand. He slowed when he saw the cluster of faces and the silence. What's going on? Malloy answered before anyone else could. Debbie refused a routine pick. You're taking over. Evan looked toward Debbie. She met his eyes and said only, read the board before you climb. Malloy stepped into his line of sight. You read me. We are behind 6 hours. Lift 17 now. Evan swallowed, set his lunchbox by the ladder, and glanced at Jace. Is there a fault? Jace hesitated, then held up the clipboard with Debbie's block letters. Malloy snatched it, tore the top page off, and crumpled it in his fist. Paper made a small dry sound in the wet morning. There. Fault solved. Nobody laughed. Debbie felt anger rise hot and clean, then forced it down into words that could be used later. Jace, photo that discarded page. Jace did. Quick, discreet, then tucked the phone against his chest. Malloy turned to the riggers and shouted, Spotters to rear! Use radio and listen for calls. Watch by sound if you lose visuals. The phrase landed on the deck like a dropped wrench. Watch by sound. In a fog this thick, with engines idling and steel ringing and radios clipping, it was not a control, it was a wish. Evan stood at the ladder with one boot on the first rung, frozen for a half-second in that narrow space between caution and obedience. Malloy pointed up at the cab. Climb, start it, do your job. Evan looked once more at Debbie. She gave him the same answer she had given Trent all morning, stripped to the minimum. You cannot see the rear arc. The system is unreliable. If you proceed knowing exactly that. Malloy stepped closer to Evan, voice low but carrying. Do it now or you're done here too. Evan climbed. Jace held the key out, and Evan took it with a hand that did not quite hide the tremor. Debbie stood outside the painted line in the wet fog, badge gone, authority removed, warning delivered, and watched hierarchy force the next move. Evan climbed, and the ladder rungs rang under his boots. Like a countdown nobody wanted to hear. Debbie kept her position outside the painted line, shoulders squared against the damp cold, and watched him disappear into the cab where she had sat for years. Malloy stood below with one hand on his radio and the other lifted in a hurry-up circle, as if speed could rewrite the conditions she had logged. The fog pressed tighter across the pad. The boom was only a dark diagonal for the first 30 feet. Then nothing. Behind the crane, the temporary diesel manifold sat where it had sat all morning, couplers shining wet under floodlights. At 6 a.m., the starter engaged. The diesel engine turned, coughed, and settled into a heavy idle that vibrated through the slab and into Debbie's boots. The red advisory lamp on the rear module flickered once, then twice, then held a weak, steady glow. From the cab, the LMI chirped its short fault pulse, the same 2-second interval she had heard during diagnostics. Evan's voice came over radio, tighter than usual. Cab to ground. I've got RACM comm warning on panel. Malloy answered immediately. Acknowledge and proceed. A pause. Debbie could picture Evan's right thumb hovering over the soft key. Warning acknowledged, he said. Proceed, Malloy repeated. Lift 17. Minimal swing, straight set. Debbie keyed in on the working channel despite knowing he would hate it. Evan, warning is active because the circuit is dropping. You're blind on the rear arc. Malloy cut across her. Debbie, clear the channel. Luis's voice arrived 1 beat later, controlled and flat. Signal to cab, I have partial visual at load, no visual rear house. Malloy snapped. Use radio continuity, spotters call clearance. Aaron checked in from somewhere behind the fog wall. Rear spotter in place. Tane came in from manifold side. Manifold side spotter in place. Watch by sound, Debbie thought, hearing engines, fork alarms, gulls, radio static, and the slap of water under the key. None of that was a control layer. It was noise. Riggers up on the slings, Malloy ordered. Chains tightened. Hook block line hummed as slack came out. The caisson segment rose against the rigging with a concrete groan, then settled, then lifted a fraction as tension equalized through both legs. Debbie tracked the load path automatically. Center of gravity, sling angle, line of action to boom tip, radius confirmation. She also tracked everything that should have happened before this moment and had not. Manifold relocation, module repair, crack assessment, dry swing. "Hold," Evan said. "I'm getting intermittent rear proximity tone." Malloy didn't hesitate. "Tone is nuisance. Keep the pick smooth." Debbie spoke again, louder, no ornament. "It is not nuisance. It is loss of rear detection." No one answered her. The line motor deepened as Evan committed to hoist. 8 seconds later, the caisson cleared cribbing by a foot. The load hung steady at first, taglines taut, riggers walking it with careful short steps on wet concrete. Luis gave hand signals at chest height, visible to the cab for a narrow corridor directly ahead. Beyond that corridor, fog erased him in layers. Debbie felt the dread sharpen not as panic, but as certainty. The operation had now crossed from bad planning into active hazard, and active hazard accumulated fast. 9 feet up, Luis called. "Travel left 5. "Copy left 5, Evan said. The house began to slew. Slow at first, then a little faster as inertia came in. Debbie turned her head to keep both load zone and rear arc boundary in view, though view was generous language for what the fog allowed. The counterweight itself was hidden. Only the rhythm of motion and the shifting groan of track pads told her where the rear was moving. "Nobody crosses rear line," she shouted to no one in particular and everyone at once. At 6:01 a.m., the fog became dense enough that Luis vanished completely from Debbie's angle when he took 3 steps toward the quayside. His voice remained on radio, but his hands were gone. 19 seconds from initial tension, the boom tip and head machinery were fully swallowed and signal continuity degraded to clipped phrases and static. "Cab, I'm losing." Luis's transmission broke. "Say again," Evan said. "Left 2, hold." The radio hissed. Malloy keyed up over him. "Evan, continue the swing. You're fine. Spotters are clear." From the rear, Aaron called, "I hear the house. Can't see the tail. Repeat, can't see tail." Debbie felt her jaw lock. "Then you are not a spotter, Aaron. You are blind. Back out." Malloy answered instead, "Stay put. Call what you can." Evan's next words were quiet, and that made them worse. "I've got rear advisory tone again." Malloy came back hard. "Ignore and keep moving. Set the piece." The house kept slewing. In clear air, Debbie would have watched counterweight clearance against fixed references and known exactly where tail edge sat. In this fog, references dissolved. The only physical cue was sound. A low air-cut whoosh from moving mass, then a faint metallic rattle as loose chain on the deck shifted with vibration. Debbie smelled diesel stronger now. Not exhaust, not the dark burnt note from engines, but fresh fuel from the manifold lane, cold and sweet. She turned toward that smell and stepped 3 paces closer to the emergency shutoff post mounted near the utility stand. She was off operations, fired, sidelined. But emergency hardware did not care who had a badge. "Malloy, stop swing," she called over open air. "You are entering manifold corridor." He pointed at her without looking. "Stay out of this." Luis cut in, voice suddenly sharp. "Cab, I have 0 visual. I repeat, 0 visual on load and rear." "Continue," Malloy said. "Radio only?" "Negative," Luis answered. "No visual means no verification." For one breath, Debbie thought that might break it. Then Evan said, "Copy radio only." And the dread settled from possibility to inevitability. He was not reckless. He was cornered. The machine sound changed as slewing continued under load. It was subtle but unmistakable to her. The slight strain tone of swing drive working against both momentum and hesitant control inputs. Evan was feathering and correcting blind, which produced microsurges. Microsurges at 96 feet became load sway at the hook and wider tail path at the rear. Then came the contact. 41 seconds after the line first took full tension, a blunt metallic crack sounded from behind the fog bank, followed by a tearing snap like thick fabric ripped in one hard pull. A half-second later, a high-pressure hiss erupted at ground level, continuous and violent. Not air, not steam. Fuel under pump pressure atomizing through an open line. "Manifold strike! Manifold strike!" Aaron shouted, voice climbing. Debbie saw it as a low, pale cloud racing sideways across the pad, not rising, hugging the cold surface and drifting with the breeze toward the light plant and heater carts. Floodlight beams turned the mist into a silver sheet. The smell hit all at once, concentrated and raw. "Kill all ignition now," she yelled. "E-stop fuel, e-stop fuel." She ran to the red mushroom button on the temporary fuel skid and slammed it with her palm. Somewhere down line a pump wound down, but pressure already in the manifold kept venting through the torn section in a hard white spray. "Shut the light plant," Louise screamed. "No one move through vapor," Debbie shouted. "Upwind, upwind." Malloy's radio was still live, still trying to command the lift, as if the event were recoverable by volume. "Evan, set it down now." From the cab, panic finally entered Evan's voice. "I can't see set point." The ignition happened at the east light plant, exactly where Debbie had expected and still hoped to avoid. A brief blue-white flash snapped at engine height, then a rolling orange front chased the diesel cloud back across the pad in a fast, ground-hugging wave. Heat hit Debbie's face like an open furnace door. She ducked behind a concrete jersey barrier as flame licked through the manifold lane, wrapped a heater frame, and curled around stacked dunnage. Workers ran in different directions for the first 2 seconds. Then training took over for some and not others. Luis grabbed Tane by the jacket and pulled him toward clear air. Aaron vaulted a hose rack, landed badly, and went down hard, clutching his wrist. Another worker slipped on wet concrete while turning from the heat and struck his shoulder against a bollard with a sound Debbie felt in her teeth. Roll him," someone shouted near the manifold. Debbie grabbed a dry chemical extinguisher from the post, yanked the pin, and ran low under the smoke edge. Tane was on one knee, disoriented, jacket smoking at the sleeves. Luis and Debbie hit him together with extinguisher bursts until the visible flame dropped to embers and steam. Tane tried to stand and couldn't. His breathing was rapid and thin. "Stay with me," Luis told him, one hand on his helmet. "Stay here." On the crane, the emergency had not paused gravity. The load was still suspended, now drifting off intended alignment as Evan tried to obey conflicting instincts. Stop swing, lower fast, avoid side load, avoid shock. Without clear sight line, each correction created another. "Cab to ground, I'm over-traveling left," Evan shouted. "Brake it," Malloy yelled. "Do not slam, brake under sway," Debbie yelled at the same time. But she was outside the command loop now and inside the physics loop, and physics was already collecting payment. Evan hit swing brake hard, then hoist down. The house jerked. The caisson, still at partial height, pendulumed, taglines whipping loose, as riggers abandoned positions to clear the heat corridor. One corner of the concrete segment clipped the edge of the receiving pad, rotated, and dropped half-seated with a deep impact thud that shook the ground. A crack shot through the caisson face with a report like a rifle shot underwater. Sharp, then dull. Concrete fragments skittered across the slab. The shock ran back through the rigging and into the boom foot and house. Debbie heard the ring gear protest as a brutal grinding bang, followed by two rapid metallic pops. Gear teeth or pinion damage she couldn't confirm from distance, but the sound was terminal enough. The house lurched 3 degrees and stopped dead. Engine rev dipped, recovered, then hunted unevenly. "Cab status," Luis called. No answer for 2 seconds. Then Evan breathing hard. "I'm okay. Swing locked. I think gear's gone." Smoke thickened along the east edge as burning diesel pooled in low spots and climbed around pallets. The fixed deluge line on that side had no pressure yet. Someone had to open the valve at the standpipe. Debbie saw Jace sprint to it, wrench in hand. He spun the wheel and water hammered into the overhead spray bar with a stuttering burst. Then a steady fan that pushed flame down but not out. At 6:03 a.m., the first external siren sounded from the terminal gate road, distant then rising. Debbie keyed emergency channel with clipped precision. "Pier 14 to dispatch. Confirmed fire event from manifold strike. Active injuries, crane load drop. Request medical and fire full response. Fuel isolation in progress." Dispatch came back, voice suddenly formal. "Copy full response. Keep channel clear for triage updates." She dropped beside Aaron, who was pale and sweating through the cold. "Can you move fingers?" He winced and nodded. "Yeah, wrist's bad." "Stay down," she said. She looked to the injured worker, who cradled his shoulder and leaned against a bollard, breathing in short bursts, but alert. "You with me?" "Yeah," he said through clenched teeth. "Shoulder." Luis was still with Tane, who had stopped trying to rise and was staring past them into fog and smoke, blinking slowly. Debbie put 2 fingers to his neck. Pulse present, fast and thready. "Medic first priority here," she called. Malloy stood 10 feet away, face gray under soot and condensation, radio hanging limp at his side. For the first time that morning, he had nothing to order. Behind him, the crane sat canted over a cracked, half-seated caisson, rear arc shrouded, advisory lamp still flickering on the damaged module as if the machine were trying to log one final objection after the fact. Fire crew trucks broke through the fog, with strobes painting red across wet steel. Medics moved in with practiced speed, kneeling at Tane, then Aaron, then the injured worker. Triage tags snapping against jackets. Debbie stepped back when told, hands shaking only after she released the extinguisher handle, and realized how hard she had been gripping it. The yard noise collapsed into distinct layers again. Pump rumble, water hiss, shouted vitals, radio codes. Evan still in the cab, answering a supervisor from operations. And above all of it, the steady crackle of fuel burning where the spray had not yet reached. She looked at the torn manifold, then at the blind fog where the counterweight had swung, then at Malloy. He had treated visibility as inconvenience, redundancy as delay, and a documented fault as attitude. The result lay all around them in heat, fractured concrete, injured workers, and a machine that would not earn another dollar that quarter. Physics had done what it always did. It ignored rank, ignored deadlines, and executed the chain exactly as described. Debbie stayed where the fire captain pointed outside the warm zone tape, while crews advanced foam and water in alternating bursts to keep the diesel from reflashing. The crackle dropped to a hiss, then to isolated pops under the spray. A port medic stepped toward her, saw the extinguisher dust on her sleeves, and asked, "You injured?" She shook her head. "No. 3 on deck. 1 with probable fracture, 1 shoulder trauma, 1 burn and inhalation." He marked her as a witness and moved on. Malloy tried to re-enter the hazard lane twice and got turned back twice, first by a firefighter and then by a port police officer who put a hand on his chest and said, "You can supervise from behind tape or not at all." He chose behind tape. Evan climbed down from the cab with both hands visible, boots careful on each rung, face ashen under soot. When he reached ground, he did not speak to Malloy. He walked straight to Debbie and said quietly, "I heard the warning tone 3 times after we started SLU." She answered, "Tell that exactly, word for word, to investigators." He nodded once and sat on a concrete block, elbows on knees, staring at his gloves. At 6:11 a.m., Incident Command established an accountability board on the tailgate of Engine 3. Names went up in grease pencil: present, transported, unaccounted. For 40 seconds, one line stayed blank while radios searched. Then a responder from the east perimeter called in that he had located Cal Mercer, the light plant mechanic, down near the cable trench beyond the manifold lane. Medics took over, worked fast, loaded, and rolled. Nobody on the pad asked questions out loud because everyone already knew what that kind of silence around a stretcher usually meant. Debbie gave her first formal statement standing beside a stack of damp rebar mats. Helmet lamp, still on in daylight that had not broken through fog yet. Port Police Sergeant Irene Vale held a recorder at chest height and kept the questions narrow. Position at time of strike: outside exclusion line, west side near emergency shutoff. Did you issue a stop recommendation? Repeatedly. Did you document hazards before lift? Yes. Debbie handed over her clipboard. The top refusal page had been torn and crumpled by Malloy, but the carbon impression remained on the duplicate sheet beneath it, faint but legible. Jace stepped forward, unlocked his phone, and showed the photo of the torn page in Malloy's fist, and the follow-up photo of that same page flattened on wet concrete 2 minutes later. Vale asked him to airdrop both files to the evidence address and watched until the transfer confirmation appeared. By 6:24 a.m., the fog thinned enough to reveal the rear of the crane and the torn manifold section in plain view. What had sounded abstract on radio now sat in hard geometry. The counterweight corner had hit the stanchion train first, shoved the line sideways, and ripped a quick connect coupler out of alignment. The coupler lugs were sheared bright at the fracture points. A Coast Guard pollution response unit arrived and placed absorbent boom along the key edge where a thin diesel sheen had reached runoff channels. One petty officer crouched by the drain throat, dipped a test strip, and told command, "Contained but reportable discharge. We're opening a federal file." He wrote the case number on a whiteboard and held it up for body cam capture. A mechanic from the crane vendor joined the investigators at 6:39 a.m. and requested power isolation before touching the house panel. Debbie listened from 10 feet away as he read the LMI event buffer aloud so 2 inspectors could transcribe independently. RACM comm drop active pre-start, drop count 7 at hold, drop count 12 at swing initiation, audible advisory acknowledged from cab. Override continuation command logged by operator input. The OSHA compliance officer asked him to repeat the last sentence. He did, Slower. The officer underlined something on her form and said, "That's enough for probable, serious, and willful review." Malloy finally spoke up then, trying to seize technical language he had dismissed all morning. "Those systems throw nuisance faults and moisture. We run through them all the time." Debbie watched the OSHA officer turn to him with professional neutrality and ask, "Did you have a qualified operator refusal on record before motion?" Malloy said, "She was being insubordinate." The officer asked again, "Did you have a refusal?" Jace answered before Malloy could reframe it. "Yes, time-stamped, 552 initial, 559 transfer under protest." Vale added, "And we have photos." Malloy stopped talking. At 7:03 a.m., Terminal Operations issued a stop work order for all lifting on Pier 14 and adjacent pads pending hazard assessment. The radio announcement was calm, almost boring in tone, and that flatness made it land harder. Effective immediately, Pier 14 closed to heavy operations. No exceptions without command approval. Tugs waiting for the caisson window were released at standby rates. 2 concrete trucks got diverted to another site and dumped partial loads at cost because cure time had already run past spec. A logistics coordinator standing near the command truck muttered to nobody in particular, "That's 40 grand gone before breakfast." The first cost board went up at 7:20 a.m. on a legal pad taped to the side of the trailer. It was rough, conservative, and still brutal. Medical and emergency response accrual. Open. Destroyed manifold and temporary fuel system. $96,000. Damaged light plants, heaters, and cabling. $184,000. Cracked caisson segment and disposal. $412,000. Crane house and ring gear assembly, preliminary. $6.8 million if repairable, replacement path higher. Berth closure exposure per day. $280,000 not counting vessel penalties. Nobody argued with the numbers. They only asked whether any line might be less bad than written. At 7:48 a.m., a hospital liaison called Incident Command and confirmed Cal Mercer had died in transit. The words moved across the yard in the way bad news always did, carried by posture before speech. Helmets lowered. Radios went quiet except for essential traffic. Debbie closed her eyes for 3 seconds, then opened them and signed the witness addendum Sergeant Vale placed in front of her. She printed carefully, as if legibility were a final obligation owed to a man who had gone to work before sunrise and did not go home. 3 days later, after scene release but before restart permission, Debbie sat in a conference room with corporate counsel, union representation, and 2 investigators from the insurer's forensic team. They asked for chronology. She gave chronology. They asked for mechanism. She gave mechanism in plain sequence. Unresolved sensor dropout, documented crack on mount weld, 0 visibility rear arc, no relocated manifold, command pressure, acknowledged warning tones, blind slew, strike, atomized fuel, ignition fire, shock load, drop damage. Counsel asked, "Could this have occurred if the hold had remained?" Debbie answered, "Not this way, not on that timeline. The hold was the control." The insurer's engineer, a quiet woman with a spiral notebook full of sketches, nodded and wrote 1 sentence in block letters. Lost chain matches pre-event objection. By the 2nd week after the fire, Pier 14 looked open from the gate, but functionally dead. The crane sat tagged out behind fencing. Boom lowered, house sealed, and every contractor entering the zone signed a legal hold notice, acknowledging evidence preservation rules. The shutdown clock crossed day 14, then day 28, then day 42, each day adding liquidated damages and birth rescheduling fees that accounting tracked in a red column titled Delay Consequence. There was no second blast, no dramatic collapse, only invoices accumulating with mechanical discipline. That was the delayed consequence nobody on site could outrun. OSHA citations arrived first. One willful for directing operation despite known safety system fault. One serious for failure to maintain exclusion controls. One serious for inadequate hazard correction on temporary fuel routing. The Coast Guard notice followed with civil penalties tied to reportable discharge and deficient spill prevention around temporary transfer equipment. Then, state labor authorities added a retaliation finding tied to Debbie's removal after documented refusal. The finding required reinstatement, back pay, and protected status as a whistleblower witness. HR called her with the decision and read from prepared language. She said, "Put it in writing," and hung up only after the email hit her inbox. 6 weeks after the incident, the insurer's reservation of rights letter became a partial denial. Coverage for portions of property damage remained, but major loss categories were carved out under intentional safety bypass and management-directed misconduct exclusions. The letter cited recorded command language, the torn refusal page, the photo chain, LMI logs, and witness statements including Evans' advisory tone report. Finance tried to absorb the gap with credit extensions, then tripped lender covenants tied to uninsured operational loss. 2 clients invoked termination clauses within the same month, both citing reliability risk rather than price. No flames, no sirens, just contracts disappearing. The final consolidated loss estimate presented to the board read $18.7 million direct and near-term indirect, with potential litigation exposure beyond that. The terminal remained partially constrained for 63 days. The crane was deemed uneconomical to repair for immediate return and booked as a quarter-ending impairment. Malloy was fired for cause before the month closed. Prosecutors filed negligence and manslaughter counts, naming his override directives and coercive threat language as central conduct. He was barred from supervisory duty, pending trial conditions. When Debbie returned to Pier 14 under reinstatement terms, she walked past the same painted arc where she had stood fired in fog and found new stanchions, new routing, new lockout tags, and a bright sign bolted at eye level. No blind lift without verified redundancy. It was a sentence she had already paid for, a sentence everyone on that yard now read before they touched a control. Debbie stood in front of the new sign and read it twice, not because the words were complicated, but because seeing them bolted to steel where her badge had been stripped felt like a correction written directly onto the yard. No blind lift without verified redundancy. The stencil paint was still sharp at the edges, and the bolts had fresh torque marks in yellow wax. Louise came up on her left with a thermos and a stack of laminated pre-lift cards under his arm. He followed her gaze and let out a slow breath. "They copied your refusal line almost word for word," he said. "They copied the mechanism," Debbie answered. "That's what matters." Luis nodded, then looked down at his gloves the same way he had on the fog morning, but this time he did not hide behind it. "I need to say this out loud. At 5:42, when he called you lazy, I went quiet because I thought if I stayed neutral, we'd get through shift. That was me choosing comfort over clarity. I won't do that again." Debbie turned toward him. "You stepped in later." "Late," he said. Still late. She took the laminated cards from him and flipped through them. The new checklist had added 3 hard stops in red print. Rear arc sensor status verified, visibility minimum met, temporary fuel routing clear of swing envelope. She handed them back. Then we use this, and we don't get late again. At 8:10 that morning, the entire Pier 14 crew crowded into the prefab safety room where diesel heat and wet jackets made the air heavy. A projector hummed against the wall. Jace stood by the screen with a laptop and an evidence transfer envelope on the table in front of him. Malloy's name was no longer on the supervisor board. In its place was interim operations lead, Carla Nguyen. She was a short woman with a clipped voice and mud on her boots, and she opened the stand down without theatrics. Today is not about blame performance, Carla said. It is about chain of causality accountability. We will walk the chain. We will name the brakes. We will lock them out of this yard. She clicked to the first slide. The anti-collision module photo with water droplets inside the housing. Then the cracked weld circled in paint. Then the crumpled refusal page in Malloy's fist. Timestamp visible in Jace's photo metadata panel. Then the flattened page retrieved from the slab. Then the LMI event log with drop counts and audible advisory acknowledgments. Jace opened the evidence envelope and placed each physical item on the table as he named it for the record. The torn original refusal page, dried and bagged. The carbon duplicate from Debbie's clipboard. The compromised gasket segment removed by the vendor mechanic under chain of custody seal. The corroded connector pin sample marked from position 9. The temporary key transfer log sheet signed 559. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been left floating as rumor. Carla pointed at the torn page photo. This was treated like insubordination in real time. In law and in physics, this is protected hazard documentation. If anyone on this site tears a safety record again, they're gone before lunch. Not suspended. Gone. No one moved. Evan sat in the second row, hands clasped so tight his knuckles were pale. Carla looked directly at him. Rudd, read your statement line 32. Evan stood, voice rough but steady. Operator received rear advisory tone multiple times after swing initiation. Operator reported warning to supervisor. Supervisor instructed continuation. Carla nodded once. That statement matched radio logs and LMI buffer. Thank you for not editing yourself to look better. Evan swallowed and sat. By noon, Debbie was in conference room B at the terminal admin building for the formal closing conference with OSHA, Coast Guard, State Labor, Company Council, and Union representation. The room smelled like printer toner and burnt coffee. Files were stacked in disciplined piles. Sergeant Irene Vale sat against the wall as observer, recorder off, notebook open. The OSHA compliance officer, Mark Heller, read findings with no extra language. Willful violation 1. Management directed operation of heavy lift despite documented active safety system fault and visibility deficiency. Serious violation 2. Failure to maintain effective exclusion zone controls under blind swing conditions. Serious violation 3. Hazardous temporary fuel routing without adequate strike protection. He turned a page. State labor determination, retaliatory removal of operator after protected safety refusal. Corrective order already served. Reinstatement, back pay, anti-retaliation posting, supervisory retraining. The Coast Guard lieutenant spoke next. Federal pollution file CG-P 14-117 is resolved as to immediate containment. Civil penalty stands. Supplemental environmental training and drain isolation retrofit are mandatory. Verification inspection passed this morning. Counsel asked the question everyone expected. Is there any dispute that ignition source was the light plant? The insurer's forensic engineer answered from her binder. No material dispute. Fuel vapor cloud reached operating light plant intake and electrical components. Ignition timing, burn pattern, and thermal imaging align. Debbie watched Malloy's empty chair at the far end of the table. He had received notice but was barred from site pending criminal conditions, so his counsel attended alone and said very little. The engineer continued tapping the report diagram where the counterweight path crossed the manifold line. Also, no dispute on initiating contact. Counterweight strike, sheared coupling lugs. That event required only one condition to prevent: no blind swing under unresolved rear arc uncertainty. Heller closed his folder. Physics does not negotiate with hierarchy. This case is now the training example. 3 days later, Debbie sat outside courtroom 4 with Luis and Jace on a hard wooden bench, polished by decades of waiting. Rain ticked against the high windows. When the bailiff called the case, they entered and took the second row. Malloy stood with his attorney, suit pressed, eyes fixed straight ahead. He looked smaller without a radio in his hand. The judge read conditions in a measured cadence. Supervisory bar in any safety-critical operation pending trial. Surrender of site credentials. No contact orders regarding witnesses except through counsel. Mandatory appearance at all hearings. Then she addressed pre-trial findings connected to employment sanctions. The court notes documented coercive directives and retaliatory conduct in a high-risk environment. Employment termination for cause remains in effect and is not stayed. Malloy's attorney requested relaxed language on the supervisory bar. The judge declined. Denied. The risk profile here is non-trivial, and the record is unusually clear. After the session in the corridor, Evans stopped in front of Debbie and spoke without dodging. I kept hearing your radio call in my headset after I climbed. I still climbed. He held her gaze. I gave full testimony, no edits. I'm not asking you to absolve me. I'm telling you I won't do that again. Debbie nodded once. Then make sure the next person under pressure hears you say no earlier than I did. He breathed out and said, I will. At the end of October, on a clear morning with 60-mile visibility and no fog bank on the water, Pier 14 ran its first authorized heavy lift since the fire. The manifold had been rerouted behind steel bollards with sacrificial guards. Rear cameras had been added to 2 cranes as supplemental aids, not replacements for line of sight. The anti-collision module on Debbie's machine had a new housing, upgraded gasket, and hard-mounted bracket with inspected welds signed and dated. Before startup, she ran diagnostics with Luis beside her and read the panel aloud. RACM status stable, no dropouts. LMI green. Carla stood by the rail with a clipboard. Operator authority check? Debbie answered active. Any person can call hold? Luis answered active. Comms redundancy? Visual, radio, and sensor all verified. Carla looked at Debbie. Proceed when you own it. Debbie put her hand on the control and waited 3 extra seconds, not from fear but from discipline. Then she hoisted, slewed, and set the test load exactly on mark. No rush, no shouting, no improvisation disguised as grit. The crew exhaled as one body when the hook came slack. Tane, back on modified duty with healed skin and a quieter manner, gave a thumbs up from behind the line and returned to his checklist. That afternoon, Debbie made one final stop before clock-out. She went to the evidence office, where Sergeant Vale had arranged property return. Vale slid a clear bin across the counter. Inside were Debbie's original clipboard, her pen with the scratched clip, and her old badge holder cracked at one corner. The torn refusal page stayed in state custody. Vale said it would remain until trial close. Debbie signed the return log and asked, "Anything unresolved in my witness file?" Vale checked the screen. "No. Dispatch call archived. Radio transcripts certified. Photo hashes verified. External agency reports linked. Your file is complete." Debbie picked up the clipboard and felt the dent where it had hit steel months earlier. "And the people who gave half statements?" Vale understood the question. "We re-interviewed everyone who paused, hedged, or stopped mid-sentence in first intake. 2 had nothing more. 1 admitted he heard watch by sound and stayed silent. That admission is now in record. No dangling statements." Outside, the pier wind smelled like cold salt instead of burnt diesel. Debbie clipped on her new badge, walked past the sign one more time, and paused just long enough to read it aloud under her breath, the way operators repeat load weights before a pick. No blind lift without verified redundancy. The sentence was no longer a warning she had to defend alone. It was procedure, posted, audited, enforced. Malloy had lost his job, his authority, and his claim to command. Cal Mercer's name was engraved on the memorial plate by the gate. The crew still carried that weight. But on Pier 14, the chain had been rebuilt with facts instead of ego, and the machine moved only when every safety layer answered yes.